Your property is in violation. You have 14 days to comply, or we will take action." She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, evenly, with a practiced weight, standing at the edge of my gravel drive in a blazer that had no business being out here among the pines. The letter she handed me was thick, folded into thirds, the kind of envelope with a red and white certified stripe that the post office uses when someone wants proof of delivery. I took it without a word and held it at my side while she explained, in the tone of someone accustomed to compliance, that the Ridgeline Pines Homeowners Association had documented multiple violations on the parcel known locally as the Carver Timber Tract, and that my continued failure to respond to prior notices I had never received because none had ever been sent, had elevated the matter to formal enforcement status. I nodded once. I did not open the envelope. What she did not know, what she could not have known, standing there with her clipboard and her careful language and her white SUV idling at the road, was that every acre she was describing, every stand of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce she gestured toward with the flat of her hand, sat on land I owned outright, not leased, not shared, not subject to any covenant or declaration or recorded instrument that gave Ridgeline Pines so much as a foothold. The deed was in a drawer in my kitchen, exactly where my grandfather had placed it in 1961, after the county recorded the transfer, and it said my name on it as clearly as the trees said mine. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're from, and if something like this has ever happened to you, I want to hear it. She left the way she came, carefully, picking her way across the wet pine duff in shoes wrong for the terrain, back to the white SUV idling at the road. I stood listening to the truck pull away, the sound of its tires on gravel diminishing south through the trees, until there was nothing left but ordinary morning quiet. Then I went back to what I had been doing before she arrived, which was counting growth rings on a windfall log at the edge of the lower stand. The timber smelled of cold resin and something older underneath. The particular damp earth smell of a forest floor composting itself for longer than anyone alive can remember. A smell that carries the weight of decades the way certain rooms carry the weight of the people who have lived in them. I had grown up with that smell. I had learned to read it the way my grandfather had taught me to read it, walking these same rows when I was 8 years old, and the trees were younger, and so was he. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. I was something closer to curious. The specific curiosity of a man who has just been handed a document making a claim he knows to be without foundation, and who wants to understand carefully and completely how the claim came to be made. My name is Elias Carver. I am 61 years old, and I have lived on this land for most of those years. My grandfather, Robert Carver, acquired the original parcel in 1947, 340 acres of second-growth timberland in the foothills east of the Cascades, purchased for back taxes from a county that had run out of patience with an absentee owner who had let the property go fallow during the war years. Robert paid $1,100 for it, in cash, because he did not trust banks and because he had been saving since he was 19. He was 32 when he signed the deed. He drove a truck with a cracked windshield up the logging road, walked the boundary lines himself with a compass and a hand-drawn plat the county surveyor had prepared, and then drove back down and started making plans. He was a timberman by trade and by temperament. He understood the difference between a forest being mined and a forest being managed, and he ran this land accordingly, thinning selectively, replanting in the same season he harvested, pulling slash and burning it in controlled piles in early spring when the ground was still wet enough to hold the fire. He kept records, not because anyone required it, but because he believed that a man who could not account for his land did not truly possess it. Those records, a series of cloth-bound ledgers with green covers and the years written on the spines in his careful hand, sat on the same shelf in the same kitchen where the deed lived. 4 generations of seasons were in those ledgers. Every cut, every replanting, every windfall, and every firebreak. My father, James Carver, took over active management in 1978 when Robert's knees gave out, and he ran the property with the same discipline and the same ledgers. He added 2 parcels to the original holding, a 60-acre woodlot to the north in 1981, and a 22-acre strip along the eastern boundary in 1989. a long rectangular bench of land that had been part of a failed homestead claim and that my father had been watching for years, waiting for it to come available. Both deeds went into the same drawer. When my father died in 2009, the full 422 acres passed to me by will and by recorded transfer, and I have managed it since in the same way, selectively, carefully, with a log of every cut and every replanting kept in the same style of green-covered ledger. I am not a sentimental man by nature. But when I walk the lower stand in the early morning, when the light is still coming in low and sideways through the fir canopy and the ground fog has not yet lifted off the creek bottom, I am aware that some of those trees were saplings when my grandfather first walked this boundary with his compass. That is not sentiment. That is a kind of record-keeping the land does on its own, independent of any ledger. The 22-acre eastern strip was the parcel that mattered most to what was about to happen. It was the flattest section of the property, a long rectangular bench where the timber was younger and more evenly spaced, the result of a replanting program my father had run in the mid-1980s after a selective harvest. The trees were lodgepole pine, now 35 to 40 feet tall, straight and clean-boled, the kind of timber that rewards patience. The strip bordered a gravel county road on its eastern edge, which made it accessible from the road, and it sat at the lowest elevation of the property, which made it visible from a distance. That visibility, I would come to understand, was the beginning of the problem. The Ridgeline Pines development had been built in stages beginning in 2003, on land that had once been a cattle ranch to the south and west of my property. My eastern strip did not adjoin the development directly. There was a 40-foot county road, right-of-way, between my fence line and the development's western boundary. I had never been contacted by the HOA in any capacity. Never a letter, never a conversation, never any reason to believe they were aware of my property's existence in any meaningful sense. That changed in the spring of the year before the woman in the blazer appeared at my drive. My neighbor to the south, a retired logger named Gus Pemberton, who had lived on his 10-acre parcel for 30 years, called me one evening in April and told me something I found difficult to understand at first. He said he had been driving past my eastern strip that afternoon and had noticed what appeared to be a crew working inside my fence line, a skid steer and a trenching machine, with several men laying electrical conduit in sections along a trench that ran parallel to the fence. I thanked Gus and drove out the next morning before the light was fully up. What I found was this: 22 RV hookup stations, pedestals, the kind you see in commercial campgrounds, with a 30-amp electrical outlet, a water connection stub, and a sewer cleanout cap, installed in 2 neat rows inside my eastern fence line, on my timberland, without my knowledge or permission, without any recorded easement or license, and without so much as a knock on my door. The work was finished. The trenches had been backfilled. The pedestals stood in their rows among my lodge poles like something planted in the night by people who had never considered that the land might belong to someone who would object. The trenching had cut through the root zones of at least a dozen of my lodgepole pines. The electrical conduit ran from a transformer pad installed directly against my fence post, set by my father in 1989, the cedar still solid in the ground, and disappeared under the fence toward the Ridgeline Pines development on the far side of the county road. I stood there for a long time without moving. The lodgepoles stood around me in their rows, patient and indifferent, their needles catching the early light. The morning was cold and smelled of turned earth and the faint ozone of new electrical work, and somewhere in the upper canopy a crow called once and did not call again. I counted the pedestals. 22. I walked the length of both rows slowly, touching each one, and counted again. I went home and got my camera, a digital body I had used for property documentation for years, set to embed the date and time in every file. I photographed every pedestal from 2 angles, every trench berm, every cut root, every section of conduit run, every disturbed fence post. I photographed the transformer pad from 4 angles, including one that showed it in direct contact with my father's cedar post. 114 photographs in total. When I got home, I downloaded every image, printed a contact sheet, and logged each photograph by number in the property notebook I kept for exactly this kind of documentation. Then I drove to the county recorder's office and pulled the plat maps for my parcel and for the Ridgeline Pines development. The plat was unambiguous. My eastern boundary was exactly where I had always understood it to be. There was no recorded easement, no license, no permit, no utility agreement, no encroachment authorization of any kind connecting the Ridgeline Pines development to my parcel. Not a line, not a note. The hookups were entirely on my land, all 22 of them, and the transformer and the conduit and the damaged root zones of a dozen trees my father had planted 40 years ago. I called my attorney, a property lawyer named Dennis Falk, who had handled my father's estate and the 2009 transfer, and who knew the Carver parcel the way a careful professional knows a file he has worked with over many years. I described what I had found, in the order I had found it, without editorializing. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man organizing what he has just heard into the correct categories. Then he said, "Send me the photographs and the plat." He called back the following afternoon and confirmed what I already knew. There was no legal basis for any structure or installation on my property. He asked if I had any idea who had authorized the work. I told him I did not yet. The answer came 3 days later, in a letter, not certified, just first class, which told me something about the sender's confidence in its own position. The letter was from the Ridgeline Pines HOA, signed by the board president, a woman named Carla Voss. It described the hookups as a community amenity expansion project and informed me that the HOA had identified my parcel as suitable for development of a recreational vehicle staging area serving HOA members. It stated that the HOA had obtained necessary approvals and looked forward to my cooperation in formalizing the arrangement. It did not mention the word easement. It did not cite a single recorded instrument. It asked me to contact the HOA to discuss compensation and ongoing access terms, as though the question were not whether they had the right to be on my land, but only what I would accept for the inconvenience of their being there. I read it twice. I set it on the kitchen table next to the green-covered ledgers my grandfather had kept, and I looked at both of them for a moment. Then I called Dennis Falk and told him we were going to need to move carefully and thoroughly. He agreed. He said he would begin with a formal title search and a survey verification, and that he would send a preservation demand to the HOA requiring them to retain all documents, communications, and records related to the project. I told him I was in no hurry. The trees were not going anywhere. The deed was not going anywhere. The photographs were dated and logged. The pedestals were sitting on my land in 2 neat rows, and every day they sat there, they were accumulating a legal history that belonged entirely to me. Gus Pemberton came by that evening, driving his old 3/4 ton up the gravel drive and parking without ceremony at the edge of the yard the way he always did. He was 74 years old and had the hands of a man who had spent 50 years in the timber industry, wide and calloused and permanently stained at the knuckle creases with the particular darkness that comes from decades of working with chain oil and bark. He accepted a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen table looking at the photographs I had spread across it. He looked at each one without speaking, moving slowly down the rows. "I've seen some things," he said after a while, setting down a photograph of the transformer pad against my father's fence post. "But I have never seen somebody put hookups on another man's land without asking." He turned one photograph over as if expecting an explanation on the back. "You know what they're planning? RV campground, essentially. I heard it at the feed store in April. One of the Ridgeline board members was talking about it like it was already done, like they'd already worked it out. April. Before the machines went in. That meant board members had been discussing the project publicly before the installation, which meant there would be meeting minutes, contractor agreements, a paper trail showing the HOA had planned and authorized the work well in advance of any contact with me. The liability ran to the board as a decision-making body, not to some contractor acting on a misunderstanding. I wrote it in my own hand in the property folder, in the same careful notation my grandfather had used in his ledgers. Gus Pemberton, conversation at feed store, April, board member describing staging area project as approved and complete. Dennis kept his office at a temperature suggesting he had never been rushed in his life. The room smelled of old paper and the faint mineral scent of a window unit air conditioner that ran year-round. And his desk was the kind that accumulates the sediment of careful work. Stacked files, a banker's box on the credenza, a legal pad with notes in a hand so small it required reading glasses to follow. He went through my photographs one at a time, holding each print at the same angle under the same lamp, making no sound except the occasional soft exhale through his nose. When he reached the photograph of the transformer pad set directly against my father's cedar fence post, he set it down and looked at it for a full 10 seconds. "Electrical service," he said finally. "Not just mechanical, they ran power to the site." I confirmed that the conduit ran from the transformer under my fence line toward the development, and that the pedestals appeared energized. Indicator lights on 2 of them had been active when I photographed them. He nodded once, slowly. He picked up the plat and held it next to the photograph of the fence line, moving his eyes between the 2. The air conditioner cycled off and the room was briefly silent. "They didn't pull a permit," he said. It was not a question. I told him I had checked with the county building department before driving to his office, and that no electrical permit had been issued for any work on my parcel, and that no utility easement had been recorded connecting the Ridgeline Pines development to my boundary line in any form. Dennis folded his hands on the desk with the deliberateness of a man closing a book he has finished reading. "Then what we have is an unpermitted electrical installation on private property, constructed without the owner's knowledge or consent by a party with no recorded right to enter or improve the land. That is trespass, and the pedestals are fixtures, installed in the ground, attached to a permanent utility service, not removable personal property." He paused. "Fixtures installed on real property without a written agreement to the contrary generally become the property of the landowner." He let that sit for a moment. 22 pedestals, I said. 22 pedestals, he agreed. He drafted the preservation demand that afternoon, a formal letter to the Ridgeline Pines HOA requiring them to preserve all documents, communications, meeting minutes, contractor agreements, permits, and any other records related to the installation without alteration, destruction, or concealment. The letter cited the relevant evidentiary preservation doctrine and advised that destruction or alteration of any such records could constitute spoliation of evidence in anticipated litigation. He sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, to the HOA's registered agent, with courtesy copies to the county building department and the county assessor's office. The title report came back in 11 days. Dennis spread it across his desk, smoothing the pages flat with his palm before he began. 43 pages, and its conclusions were unambiguous in the way that only a clean title can be unambiguous. The Carver parcel was held in fee, simple, absolute, free and clear of any mortgage, lien, covenant, restriction, or encumbrance of any kind. No easement of record benefited the Ridgeline Pines development or any predecessor in interest. No recorded license, no utility easement, no access agreement, no prescriptive easement claim, no pending action of any kind touching the parcel. The county road right-of-way was 40 feet wide, exactly as the plat showed, and neither my property nor the Ridgeline Pines development had any private right to use it for utility installations without a separate encroachment permit from the county, which had not been issued, as the county engineer's office confirmed in writing. Dennis read the relevant paragraph aloud, quietly, in the tone of a man reading a verdict he already knew. Title to the subject property is vested in Elias James Carver, a single man, as his separate property, in fee simple, free and clear of all encumbrances of record. No easement, covenant, condition, restriction, or other recorded instrument was identified that would grant any right of access, use, or improvement to any adjacent landowner, homeowners association, or other entity. He set the report down. "So they have nothing," I said. "They have 22 pedestals on your land," Dennis said. "A transformer pad against your fence post, a conduit run under your fence line, and no legal basis for any of it." He paused. "What they do not have is a single recorded instrument that gives them the right to be there. The HOA's attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt, practicing general business and real estate law in the county seat, whose letterhead listed 6 practice areas, had replied to the preservation demand with a response notable for what it did not say. It did not identify any easement. It did not cite any permit or recorded instrument. What it said, in careful and slightly evasive language, was that the HOA had proceeded in good faith based on its understanding that the parcel was available for community use and that the board was open to good faith negotiation regarding compensation and formalization of the arrangement, available for community use. I had owned the parcel for 14 years at that point, and my family had owned it for 62. It had never been available for anything except timber management. The idea that a homeowners association had looked at a fenced, actively managed timber parcel with a county recorded deed and concluded it was available, without once checking the county recorder's index to confirm who held title, without once reading the posted survey markers my father had installed in 1989, was something I found difficult to account for, not as malice, but as institutional carelessness so thorough it had the texture of something else entirely. Dennis filed the formal demand for removal the following week. The letter, sent certified mail to the HOA's registered agent and to Gerald Pruitt directly, set out the full legal position without preamble. The Carver parcel was held in fee simple by Elias James Carver. No easement, license, or other recorded instrument authorized any entry, installation, or improvement by the Ridgeline Pines HOA or any party acting on its behalf. The installation of 22 electrical pedestals, a transformer pad, and associated conduit constituted trespass and unpermitted construction under county code. The fixtures had become the property of the landowner by operation of law, and the HOA was required to remove all equipment within 30 days or face legal action for trespass, ejectment, damages including restoration of the root-damaged timber stand, and any additional relief the court found appropriate. The letter also noted that the HOA's failure to obtain a permit had been reported to the county building department, and that the county had opened a code enforcement file, with daily fines accruing from the date of the order. Gerald Pruitt's second letter arrived on a Thursday morning and was longer than the first, which is not always a sign of strength. He cited Article 7, Section 3 of the Ridgeline Pines, CC and RSD, which authorized the board to develop recreational amenities on land contiguous to the development for the benefit of members, and argued that this authorization, combined with the HOA's good faith belief that the parcel was unencumbered and available, constituted a sufficient basis for the project. I read Article 7, Section 3, twice, slowly, the way Dennis had taught me to read any document someone was using as the foundation of a legal claim. It authorized the board to develop recreational amenities on land contiguous to the development. It said nothing about land the HOA did not own. It said nothing about land owned by a third party. It contained no mechanism by which the HOA could obtain rights over land it did not hold title to. It was, in the most precise legal sense, a grant of authority to develop the HOA's own property, not a license to enter anyone else's. The section did not contain the word easement. It did not contain the word acquisition. It did not contain the word consent. I called Dennis and read him the relevant passage over the phone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he cited internal governing documents as authority over land outside the association's jurisdiction. I told him that was my reading as well. That is not a legal argument, Dennis said. That is a letter. He filed the complaint the following week. The action was captioned Carver versus Ridgeline Pines Homeowners Association et al., filed in the County Superior Court. The claims were trespass, ejectment, unpermitted construction, and quiet title. The complaint set out the full chain of title for the Carver parcel, beginning with Robert Carver's 1947 deed and running through every recorded transfer to the present, with each instrument identified by recording number and date. It attached the title report, the survey verification, the county plat, the building department's confirmation of no permit, the code enforcement file number, and all 114 dated photographs, organized by subject and location. It attached the HOA's own letter describing the project as a community amenity expansion, a written admission that the HOA had authorized and directed the work. It attached Gerald Pruitt's 2 letters, including the citation of Article 7, Section 3, which the complaint analyzed in a single paragraph that was, by Dennis's standards, almost withering. The cited provision authorized development of association-owned property and created no right, license, easement, or other interest in any parcel not held in the association's name, as confirmed by the recorded plat and the title report attached hereto as exhibits. The complaint asked for ejectment of all installed equipment, restoration of the disturbed timberland to its pre-installation condition, including replacement of any damaged trees, damages for trespass and root damage, attorney's fees under the applicable trespass statute, and a judgment quieting title to the Carver parcel against any claim by the Ridgeline Pines HOA or any successor entity. The court set an initial hearing for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the county building department issued a stop work order and cited the HOA for unpermitted electrical work, with a daily fine accruing from the date of the order. The county also notified the utility company that had energized the transformer and the utility company, after reviewing the permit record and confirming that no easement existed connecting the installation to any permitted service address on my parcel, disconnected the transformer within 48 hours. The indicator lights on the 2 active pedestals went dark. I walked the eastern strip the evening the power was cut. The lodge poles stood in their rows in the late-day quiet, the pedestals between them cold and inert, their indicator panels blank. 2 of the trees nearest the deepest trench section had begun to show stress in their needles, a yellowing at the tips that I had been watching and photographing weekly since the installation. I added that evening's photographs to the folder with a note on the date and the progression of the discoloration. The county fine was accruing. The complaint was filed. The paper was doing its work, exactly as I had expected it to do. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and the particular institutional stillness of a room that has heard a great many arguments and been moved by very few of them. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Sievert, who had been on the bench for 18 years and who had, according to Dennis, a reputation for reading the record carefully and deciding cases on what it contained rather than on what the parties wished it contained. Carla Voss was there, seated at the defendant's table in a blazer similar to the one she had worn to my drive, dark, pressed, carrying the same practiced authority. Gerald Pruitt sat beside her with a folder of documents and the expression of a man who had begun to understand, sometime in the preceding weeks, that the ground beneath his position was not as firm as he had initially represented to his client. Dennis presented the chain of title first. He walked through each deed, 1947, 1981, 1989, 2009D, and entered each into the record with its recording number and date. He entered the title report, the survey verification, the county plat, the building department's confirmation of no permit, the code enforcement file, all 114 photographs in their organized binders, the HOA's own letter, and Gerald Pruitt's 2 letters, including the Article 7 citation. He read Article 7, Section 3 aloud, slowly and completely, so that the record would contain it in full. Judge Sievert read the provision herself, holding the page at the angle of a person reading carefully rather than scanning. She read it once, then read it again. She set it down on the bench. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "this provision authorizes the association to develop recreational amenities on land contiguous to the development. It does not authorize development on land owned by a third party. Where in your governing documents or in any recorded instrument does the association obtain a right of access or improvement on the Carver parcel?" Gerald Pruitt stood. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He said the HOA had proceeded in good faith. He said the parcel had appeared unoccupied and unimproved from the road. He said the board had believed the land was available for community use. He did not cite an easement. He did not cite a recorded instrument. He cited Article 7, Section 3 again, and Judge Sievert let him finish without interruption, and then she said, The provision you are citing governs the association's authority over its own property. The Carver parcel is not the association's property. It has never been the association's property. The chain of title entered into evidence establishes fee simple ownership in Mr. Carver running back to 1947, free and clear of any encumbrance that would benefit the association. Do you have a recorded instrument that contradicts that title report? He did not. Judge Sievert ruled from the bench. She found that the Ridgeline Pines HOA had trespassed on the Carver parcel by installing 22 electrical pedestals, a transformer pad, and associated conduit on land owned in fee simple by Elias James Carver, without his knowledge or consent, without any recorded easement, license, or other legal authority, and without obtaining the required county permits. She found that the fixtures had by operation of law become the property of the landowner. She ordered the HOA to remove all equipment within 60 days at its own expense and to restore the disturbed land to its pre-installation condition, including replacement of any timber damaged by the installation trenching at a restoration cost to be determined by a licensed arborist and forester. She awarded attorney's fees under the applicable trespass statute. She entered a judgment quieting title to the Carver parcel against any claim by the Ridgeline Pines HOA or any successor entity, and she ordered that judgment recorded with the county recorder within 30 days. She closed the proceeding with the efficiency of a person who has read the record and found it dispositive. The courtroom was quiet. Carla Voss sat very still at the defendant's table, her hands flat on the surface in front of her. Gerald Pruitt gathered his folder without speaking. I sat with the ruling for a moment, in the wooden chair, in the institutional quiet of the room. Not quite satisfaction, and not quite anticipation, but the same neighborhood as both. The HOA did not comply within 60 days. They pulled the pedestals and the conduit, but left the transformer pad in place and made no effort to address the restoration of the disturbed timberland or the replacement of the damaged trees. Their position, communicated through a brief letter from Gerald Pruitt, was that the restoration cost estimate prepared by the licensed arborist and forester Dennis had engaged was excessive, and that they intended to contest it. They did not contest it in court. They simply did not pay, and the daily county fine continued to accrue against the transformer pad they had left behind. Dennis called me on a Wednesday morning, his voice carrying the flat, unhurried precision he used when a matter had reached the point where the law offered something specific and unambiguous. He told me that the judgment, now past due and unsatisfied, gave me a remedy I had not yet used. Under the applicable statute governing unpermitted encroachments on timberland, a judgment creditor holding a court order for trespass and encroachment may foreclose on the encroachment itself, treating the trespass and the installed fixtures as a lien against the offending party's interest in the encroachment footprint, and may additionally seek a court-supervised sale of any timber damaged or condemned by the encroachment, with proceeds applied to the outstanding judgment balance. The statute was specific about timberland. It had been written for exactly this kind of situation, which is to say, for the situation where someone builds on ground they do not own and then declines to make the owner whole. I had not wanted to use that remedy. I had given them 60 days under the court's order, and then 30 more of my own patience, and they had responded with a letter disputing an arborist's report they had never commissioned and a restoration estimate they had never sought to negotiate in good faith. I told Dennis to file the foreclosure action. The filing was captioned as a foreclosure of encroachment lien under the judgment entered in Carver v. Ridgeline Pines Homeowners Association et al. It identified the transformer pad still sitting against my father's cedar fence post as the physical anchor of the foreclosure, the 22 pedestal locations as the documented footprint of the encroachment, and the outstanding judgment balance, restoration costs, attorney's fees, accrued county fines, and the documented timber loss value, as the amount the foreclosure was designed to satisfy. The arborist's report, which Dennis had already entered into the original record, had identified 8 lodgepole pines in the trench zone as condemned, root systems compromised beyond recovery, growth potential reduced to the point where the trees would not reach harvestable dimension within any reasonable projection. Those 8 trees, standing on my timberland, damaged by the HOA's trenching equipment, were now the subject of a court-authorized timber sale. The HOA had planted 22 pedestals on my land without asking. The land was now going to settle the account on its own terms. Let me step outside the story for a moment and tell you what was actually happening here, because I think it matters. Elias had spent the better part of 2 years being methodical, photographing, filing, waiting, letting the record accumulate. He had not raised his voice once. He had not confronted Carla Voss at a board meeting or posted anything on a community forum or called a single journalist. What he had done was build a file so complete and so clean that when the law offered him its most serious remedy, foreclosure, the record supported it without amendment. The HOA had handed him that remedy by leaving the transformer pad in the ground and declining to pay. That is the thing about institutional carelessness at this scale. It does not stop being careless just because a court has ruled. Stay with me. The court issued the foreclosure order on a Thursday morning. I was not in the courtroom for that hearing. Dennis called me from the parking lot outside and read me the operative paragraph over the phone, standing in the cold in his good coat, his breath visible in the air between sentences. The court had authorized the foreclosure of the encroachment lien, directed the sheriff's office to execute against the HOA's identified assets, specifically the Common Area Reserve Fund and the HOA's interest in the encroachment footprint. If the judgment remained unsatisfied within 15 days, and separately authorized the landowner to proceed with the sale of the condemned timber on the Carver parcel, with net proceeds credited against the outstanding judgment balance and any surplus returned to the judgment creditor. I thanked him and set the phone down on the kitchen table next to the green-covered ledgers. The timber sale was not a large transaction, and I want to be precise about that. 8 lodgepole pines condemned by root damage, ranging from 35 to 40 feet in height, straight boled and clean, the kind of timber a small mill operator values for dimensional lumber and post stock. I called a licensed timber buyer named Walt Greer, who had purchased selective cut timber from the Carver parcel twice before and who knew the eastern strip from those transactions. He walked the condemned trees with the arborist's report in his hand, touching each trunk in turn, reading the needle discoloration at the tips the way a man reads a text he has encountered in other forms before. He made his assessment without theatrics. He offered a figure per board foot that was fair by current market rates for lodgepole of that dimension and quality, and I accepted it. The sale was documented, the court was notified, and the proceeds were designated for application against the outstanding judgment balance. The felling was done on a cold morning in early winter, the ground frozen hard enough to hold the skidder without rutting, the air sharp with resin and chainsaw exhaust and the particular cold that comes off the mountains before the light is fully up. Walt's crew worked quietly and efficiently, the way timber crews work when they have done the job long enough to have nothing left to prove. The 8 trees came down in sequence, limbed and bucked on the ground, the sections loaded and hauled out the gravel road to Walt's mill yard by mid-morning. I walked behind the crew as they worked, not directing, only watching, the way my grandfather had walked behind his own crews in this same stand when the trees were younger, and so was he. The sound of the skidder faded down the road, and then there was only the cold air and the rows of standing lodgepoles and the bright raw stumps of the 8 condemned trees, their cross-sections showing the growth rings my father's replanting program had laid down year by year since the mid-1980s. I counted the rings on the nearest stump the way I had counted the rings on the windfall log the morning Carla Voss had come to my drive. 37 years of growth, destroyed by a trenching machine operated by people who had never once checked whose land they were standing on. The proceeds from the timber sale, combined with the foreclosure action Dennis had filed against the HOA's Common Area Reserve Fund, resolved the outstanding judgment in full within the 15-day window the court had set. The HOA paid the remaining balance 4 days before the sheriff was scheduled to execute the writ. I was told later by Gus Pemberton, who heard it at the feed store the way he heard most things, that the board had held an emergency meeting to authorize the payment and that the meeting had not gone smoothly. I did not attend that meeting. I had no reason to. The payment covered the restoration costs, the attorney's fees, the accumulated county fines, including every day the transformer pad had sat against my father's fence post after the deadline, and the balance of the documented timber loss value not covered by the lumber sale proceeds. Dennis confirmed receipt and filed the satisfaction of judgment with the county recorder the same afternoon. The foreclosure action was closed. The code enforcement file was closed. The county recorded the quiet title judgment and the satisfaction of the encroachment lien in the same instrument, and the Carver parcel's title page in the county index was clean again, fee simple, free, and clear, exactly as it had been since 1947. The transformer pad came out the following week. The HOA hired a contractor at their own expense, the concrete footing broken out and hauled away, the hole filled and tamped level with the surrounding grade. I did not watch them do it. I had work of my own in the upper stand that morning, and I did it. The replacement seedlings went in the following spring, 12 lodgepole pines, selected by the arborist for the specific soil conditions of the trench zone, planted in the line where the condemned trees had stood. They were small and straight, their new growth bright at the tips, the way my father's original planting had been small and straight in the mid-1980s, before it became the stand that now surrounded them. They would not be my trees for long in any meaningful sense. They would belong to whoever came after, the way the oldest firs in the lower stand had belonged to my grandfather before they became my father's and then mine. That is the arithmetic of managed timberland. You plant for someone you will never meet, and you are grateful to the person who planted for you. The gravel drive was quiet the morning I walked the eastern strip after the seedlings went in. The lodgepoles stood in their rows, the new growth at their tips, the particular bright green of a tree that has decided to continue. The soil between the rows was settled and dark, the berm lines of the old trenches barely visible now, the ground reclaiming its own level. The fence line ran where my father had set it in 1989, straight and unchanged, the cedar posts still solid in the ground, the wire still taut between them. The stumps of the 8 condemned trees had been ground to grade, their wood fiber turned back into the soil that had grown them. The land did not look like a place where anything had happened. That was, I thought, exactly right. I stood there for a while, the way I had stood there the morning I first counted the pedestals, in the cold air that smelled of resin and turned earth and the slow patience of a forest composting itself for longer than anyone alive can remember. The crow that lived in the upper canopy called once, the same single note it always offered to the morning, and did not call again. The deed was in the drawer, the judgment was satisfied and on record. The timber had been sold, the proceeds accounted for, the line item entered in the ledger in the same careful notation my grandfather had used for 60 years. The seedlings were in the ground. When an institution with apparent authority makes a claim against you, a letter, a citation, an ultimatum delivered at the edge of your drive by someone in a blazer who has rehearsed the words, the first question is not whether to comply, and it is not whether to fight. The first question is whether the claim has a legal foundation. That question has an answer, and the answer is always in the record. The record does not care about good faith. It does not care about community intent or governing documents or the belief that land appeared available from the road. It cares about what is written, what is filed, what is surveyed, what is deeded, and what has been held across generations by people who understood that the only way to truly possess a piece of ground is to be able to account for it completely at any moment someone asks. And when an institution declines to honor a court's order, when it leaves a transformer pad against your fence post and sends a letter disputing an arborist's report, the record has a remedy for that too. It is called foreclosure, and it is as old and as patient as the land itself. My grandfather understood that. My father understood it. I have tried to understand it in the same way, with the same ledgers and the same patience, and when the time came to let the record speak, it spoke clearly. The lodgepoles stood in their rows in the morning light, the new seedlings among them, and the land was quiet, and it was mine. If you have a land story, a boundary dispute, an HOA overreach, an easement that someone decided meant something it does not, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and if you want to be here for the next case, which involves a deeded lake access that a county road department decided to reroute without telling the deeded owner, subscribe, and stay close. That one took 4 years, and a surveyor who found a monument nobody had looked for in 40 years.